Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Persistence on macOS. This talk is, as you guessed it, all about code persistence on macOS. And just so you know, it's easier than you think. So, before we get started, here's a bit about me. I'm Andrew Vanderbilt. By day, I'm a system admin at a startup in Central Florida, and by night, I lead the technical work over at Vander Security. Most people seem to know me as the Apple guy, which is kind of accurate, I guess. But I do a lot of Linux stuff too. I also wrote BridgeBlock and AirWatch, so check those out if you find this talk interesting. First up is going to be our crash course on macOS for the noobs. It's okay if you're not super experienced with Macs. We're going to draw some comparisons to help you out. After that, we'll go over the advantages of persistence, followed by the many places you can find it in macOS. We'll talk a little bit about the future and follow up with a demo where we revive a piece of malware from 2018. For in-person attendees, we also have a live lab where you're going to be trying to remove that same malware from virtualized Mac systems. So, macOS. What is macOS? Well, it's a certified Unix OS made up of a Mach microkernel with a FreeBSD user space on top. Apple refers to this internally as Darwin, and that FreeBSD part gives it its Unix personality, which means that many of the same persistence techniques you would try on Linux or BSD will also work on macOS. It really is a unique operating system, so I guess it makes sense that their mascot is a platypus. Now, in my experience, the biggest problem people have with figuring out macOS is not how strange the kernel is. It's just relating it to the things they already know. And the truth is, macOS uses plenty of the same concepts, just in different ways. Here's a nifty chart to show you what I mean. You're going to find that most of the things you know from Windows or Linux carry over. They just have different names or they work slightly differently. Linux, of course, comes with the caveat of being distro-specific. Now, on Windows, you have a centralized configuration area called the registry, where you're setting keys and values and whatnot. On macOS, it's a bit different. It's far less centralized, and they are called property lists. They're essentially special XML files that set some values for daemons and other parts of the system. On Linux, you get dot files, those configuration files in your home directory that are usually hidden. On Windows, we have exes. On macOS, we have mock executables. And on Linux, we have elf files. As far as shared libraries go, we have DLLs in Windows, dynamic libraries in macOS, and on Linux, we have shared objects. Desktop shortcuts are pretty similar to free desktop schema on Linux. macOS kind of deviates here with the doc plist. It's just a property list file that lists everything in the doc. And just like you would modify a desktop shortcut in order to hijack it on Windows, you can do the same thing with the doc plist. Explorer.exe provides us with our file management. Finder does the same on macOS, and it's equivalent to Linux's Dolphin, Thunar, and whatever else comes with your desktop environment. On Windows, we get tasks, and on macOS, we have cron and launchd. Launchd is pretty similar to systemd, at least in what it does. But Linux being Linux, you're going to find cron and initd and all these other init systems depending on the distro. On Windows, we of course have Windows Defender for anti-malware, and here's something many people don't realize about macOS. It comes with anti-malware, and it's called Xprotect. It actually uses the same format for its definition files as ClamAV. Yeah. The actual malware removal is handled by MRT, the malware removal tool. And of course, on Linux, you don't get anything like that because it's Linux. On Windows, you have the Windows Communication Foundation, On macOS, you have XPC, and on Linux, you have dbus and pipes. These all serve the function of facilitating inter-process communication. So, why do we want persistence? Because you don't want your access to be conditional. You want to maintain your presence even if the user isn't present. It also gives you the advantage of time. When you have persistence, you can spread out your activities, making it less likely that you will be noticed. Well-hidden persistence is also a valuable way to resist remediation. If you can hide your foothold from the AV, you get multiple chances to try again, even if some parts of your malware gets removed. So long as you keep the foothold, you can keep trying. Now, persistence is especially important on a Mac because the OS is really locked down. You have to work to get root, and sometimes that means waiting for privesk opportunities. And sometimes you're going to be chaining multiple things together just to get a solid persistence, especially privileged. Now, we've spoken a little bit about this, but what are we up against here? We know what we want, so what's going to try and get in our way? Now, I'm sure you've heard those ridiculous stories about how macOS is super secure and trying to hack it is a waste of time or something. That's what the guy at Best Buy tells me, at least. Truth is, it is a pretty robust OS, I'm not going to lie, but it does have some weaknesses. We're going to focus on the strengths first, though. So thanks to the crypto verification of the boot chain, you aren't going to be able to bootkit an ARM Mac in its default configuration. The public keys used for verification are burned into the secure Enclave ROM, and thus far the private keys have never been leaked. Users can reduce these protections, but don't count on them doing that. The base OS image is stored on a read-only drive called the sealed system volume, so even if you were able to somehow modify the contents of the disk, it'll fail crypto verification, and the Mac just won't boot it anymore. And if a Mac doesn't boot anymore, what's the next thing that the user's going to do? Boot into recovery mode. And that downloads a clean macOS image from Apple servers, verifies it, and wipes the disk so it can reinstall it. And there you go. You lose your foothold and any other persistence that you had set up. So, protections extend into the running system as well. System integrity protection and rootless prevent modification of system files while the OS is running. Code signing is widespread and strongly enforced. I think sooner or later it's going to become mandatory too. The app sandbox is really tight, so even if you do get persistence off of a process, you might not be able to do anything useful with it. Pointer authentication and the secure enclave assume a hostile user space. TCC, transparency, consent, and control, is the privacy protections. And they limit where and what we can access at runtime. The Endpoint Security Framework is a more recent addition to macOS, and it's maturing pretty fast. It essentially gives vendors and anti-malware insight into events occurring on the system. So if you're deploying an anti-malware or endpoint security solution to your Macs, you should look into whether or not they're using ESF. All that being said, I find that the more practical solution is to work around the restrictions rather than defeat them directly. We can still abuse the functionality they give us, and for that, we do have a lot of options. From the functionality that is exposed to apps to parts of the system itself, there are plenty of places for us to hide. We're going to step through each of these categories I've made and discuss their characteristics. Keep in mind, though, that this list and all the items in it are far from complete. I've selected what I feel is a good representation of all of them as a whole, so you'll have to do some more research on your own to find the rest. So let's start with the functionality provided to apps. The items I put in this category are provided to apps and users as legitimate but abusable functionality. They can be useful in one way or another, but are usually restricted by the sandbox, so their practical use is limited. UI automation being a notable exception to this. We'll get more into that. But first up are Spotlight importers, and these extend Spotlight with additional data sources. So whenever you do command space and you search for, say, AALP stock, that result that you're being displayed is provided by a Spotlight importer. It goes out on the internet, grabs the data. So most useful is their ability to parse file contents for indexing purposes, and they do have internet access. But exfiltrating the data that you've got is the hard part. They're restricted to reading files, and the only thing they can write to is a scratch directory. And because Gatekeeper is present on a Mac, you can't just download malicious code into that and execute it. It won't let you. So if you have a way to escape the sandbox, that's much less of a problem, and then Spotlight importers become pretty cool again, but you do need a sandbox escape. Blue Team can find these by running md import with the L option, and it'll just list all of them in terminal that are loaded. All right, so UI automation. This one is really powerful, and it's easy to leverage this in a couple different ways. Most parts of macOS's UI can be scripted, barring a few restricted things. An app we wrote a while back, AirWatch, I mentioned that earlier, actually uses this for some of its functionality. These scripts can be written in a variety of languages, even JavaScript, if you can believe that. And then you can package them into apps using Automator, which is the robot with a pipe in the bottom right. So a lot of anti-malware won't trigger on these, especially if you're mixing and matching with the source of your actions, some of it being Apple script, some of it being Automator actions. My favorite thing to do with them is to create message boxes that mimic real system dialogues. And it makes them great for tricking end users into giving up their passwords, and it works more often than you think it would. Finding these on a system can be difficult since you can bundle them into a standalone app, and they can disguise themselves just like any other app. Automator displays a gear in the icon bar when it's running, and usually the upper right in the menu bar extras. So keep a lookout for that. That's the most clear sign that you've got an Automator app on the system. And to give you an idea of how flexible these Automator apps can be, and UI scripting in general, there have been several malware strains written entirely in them. In fact, Chicanepire is based off of a strain of Automator malware. Lamepire, which we based it off of, is also entirely written in Automator. That's the script it uses. So, I want to play a game. I'm going to show you two dialogues. Both will ask for your authorization, but only one of them is real. So which is it? If you haven't guessed by now, it's too late, because your users have already clicked on it. They don't see this often enough to know what the real one's supposed to look like. For all of you who are still wondering, the one on the right is fake. So, dynamic libraries. Patrick Wardle wrote about these a while back, and as a result, Apple tightened up on how we can use them. Essentially, dynamic libraries do for macOS as DLLs do for Windows, like we talked about earlier. It used to be that you could place a malicious dylib file in the search path to get yourself injected into a process. This was known as a weak reference, but they don't work anymore. dylibs are now required to be code signed, and weak references are no longer supported. Patrick Wardle also wrote an app called DHS, which can search your system for weak references. If you run it, even on a modern Mac running Ventura, you will find there are still weak references, especially if you've got third-party apps installed. Whether or not they're exploitable, however, left to be said. Now, on to the BSD utilities. If you're a regular user of Linux or especially FreeBSD, you already know these. They're tried true, and they definitely work, which is why they are on the way out. Apple is committed to slowly deprecating them in future Mac OS releases for, you guessed it, security reasons. It's not surprising, especially when things like emon-D are almost exclusively used by malware these days. I mean, I have not seen it legitimately used in years. They still do work, though, so use them while you can. Shell hijacking, which you'll see towards the bottom, is a persistence method we're going to go into greater detail about just because of how useful and flexible it is. Apple can't really get rid of this one without removing the Unix from their Unix OS. So this consists of injecting commands into the configuration files that are executed when a user starts a shell session. We can spawn off processes, alias commands, and modify the shell's behavior. This is a great method, but it does rely on the user opening shell sessions. That being said, when's the last time you actually checked your shell config? It could have something like this hiding in it. We use this script to intercept sudo, steal your credentials, and then present the real sudo command. Everyone puts in their password wrong sometimes, so it wouldn't really raise suspicion. Use those creds to privesc, then clean up the aliases after, and no one's the wiser that you were ever there. System services. So these are things that provide some functionality central to the operating system itself. Profiles are probably the most common one you're going to find in use. They're all limited by the fact that you need admin privileges anyway to interact with these. So they might not be good for privesc, but they do give you persistence. These are device configuration plists that are intended for management systems like Intune or Jamf. They're surprisingly well integrated with macOS. If you download one in Safari, it is automatically added as an option in system preferences. The user just has to go in there and approve it. If you can social engineer them into doing it, well, that's money. If you have root, you can also load them from the command line without user interaction. So they're good for entrenching yourself deeper into the system in that way. But even if you load them from the command line, they're still going to show up in system preferences. I see these fairly often as a way to hijack Safari. Like launchd items, they aren't very stealthy though. You can just click on it and then click the minus icon to remove it. Not the best. Launchd is kind of like systemd on Linux. It offers apps a way to execute code on login or boot, mostly to facilitate services like auto updates or background task handling, daemons. Launch agents are spawned by launchd when the user logs in, and launch daemons start with the system. These are far from stealthy. Just like the profiles, the user is presented with a list, and they can just turn them off at will. On the top part, for the items that open on login, they can just click it and remove it. A lot of legit apps rely on these, so it's not an immediate red flag should a user see it. It is going to make them suspicious. As far as persistence vectors go, I see these the most out of everything we've covered today. If you have root, I recommend hijacking an existing one of these to launch your code. No matter how you go about it, the user's going to get notified, so at least hide in something that's already there. Now, kexts. These sound like a great idea until you realize the effort that it requires. You do get practically unlimited power at runtime, assuming you can get the signing key from Apple. They are not stealthy by default. You have to do some work to hide the fact that you're loaded and to modify the GUI flow that allows users to unload or remove kexts. They're not bad, but they do require that you do work. You're also writing in C++ against X and U here. You're not in user space anymore, Toto. If you throw an unhandled exception in kext code, you will crash the system, and your kext will show up in the debug log for that. That happens too many times, it's gonna hit help desk and work its way up, and somebody will realize what you're up to. Apple also doesn't give out the signing keys for kernel extensions freely. You have to be an Apple developer, and you have to specially request them. They're pretty picky about it. If you tell them you need it to do something that can be done in user space, they'll just tell you no. And the situations in which kernel extensions are needed are becoming more and more infrequent as time goes on. Overall, though, if you know enough about XNU and writing kernel modules, you don't need me to tell you much about these. App hijacking is probably the most diverse method of persistence in terms of stealth and difficulty, because it is really just dependent on the apps. Apple has done a lot to address some of the most common problems third-party apps have. Things like updates over HTTP or executing interpreted code are either hidden behind entitlement flags or not allowed altogether. But if an app isn't using an Apple API to do something, they don't have to stay within Apple's security rails. Practically speaking, third-party apps are a lot more practical to exploit and hijack compared to the OS itself, in my opinion. But you do have to find vulnerable apps that are persistently exploitable to boot. Defending against these is also quite difficult because it's so situational. It's unique for every app. So that's been a brief overview of persistence methods, but what's in it for the future? Well, we've seen over time that macOS is becoming more difficult to exploit. The macOS of 2012 is nothing like it is in 2023. Especially for the kind of exploits that can be leveraged for privileged persistence. We've seen how much of a wasteland the iOS public jailbreaking scene has become. When's the last time we had an untethered jailbreak exploiting iOS itself? It wasn't checkrain, for anyone thinking that, because that was an attack on the USB stack. So imagine if Apple locked down macOS to that degree. And it's pretty obvious that macOS is intended to be iOSified over time to achieve Apple's security goals. You're going to be seeing Tim Apple in your nightmares. iOS 14 and macOS Catalina included plenty of kernel hardening measures that limits our ability to obtain kernel-level persistence. I expect that this trend is going to continue over time. But that being said, the future isn't all grim, because macOS still has plenty of stupid bugs. Logical errors like power directory, kernel semantics mix-ups, and plenty of buffer overflows all serve to degrade those protections. The user space security model has some holes in it too. NS Workspace is technically deprecated, but it still works and can be used to bypass sandboxing. And on the topic of sandboxing, apps that don't implement it can use Terminal to do evil things. So if Terminal has full disk access, non-sandbox apps do too. The system immutable bit can also be weaponized, and I don't see this used nearly often enough. So for those of you who aren't familiar, if you right-click on a file in Finder, and then you choose Get Info, there is a checkbox that says Locked. If you check it, it sets the user immutable bit. So in the user context, that file cannot be deleted, overwritten, modified in any way until you unlock it. The system immutable bit does the same thing, but all the way down to the root level. This can be really useful because you can establish persistence and then protect all of your malicious files by setting the system immutable bit, and then just trash the sudoers file so they can't invoke sudo anymore. And the only way to remove you is A, reinstall macOS, or B, boot into single user mode and try to fix it. I'm sure more of these bugs are going to come up over time, especially the kind of exploits that, like CVE 2021-3657. These, along with the other one, allowed you to just bypass Gatekeeper entirely. So as those opportunities arise, you need to take advantage of them. So this talk was originally made for CitrusSec. It was probably one of the first talks that they've had in a long time. So go buy Supersat a beer if you liked it. I also recommend that you check out Patrick Wardle's The Art of Mac Malware, TAOMM.org. We have our own selection of free Mac security apps available on our website at vandersecurity.com in the Tools section. I also recommend that you check out macOS hardening by Atumo, I think it's pronounced. Great resources, and they can really get you up to speed. So let's use what we've learned. Let's make some persistent malware of our own with these techniques. So the second half of this demo is interactive, so I hope you are paying attention, because when we hit the lab portion, you're going to have to use what you learned here. So for the demo, we're going to be abusing Automator, and we decided to remake Lamepire. It's a really low effort malware, well, spyware to be more particular, from around 2018. It's notable for being really shitty, yet somehow big enough of a problem to make the news. It's really sad. I can only imagine the name to be a pun on Empire, that Python post framework from around the same time period. It really is bad. So your first obvious indicator of compromise is the Automator gear in the menu bar just spinning away. And if you click on it, it says Discord app because that's the name of the app that invoked the process. But like you can see right below that, the so-called Discord app is just an Automator icon. Who would fall for that? Second is the presence of a new launch agent login item that just starts Discord app back up every time the user logs in. Now, on Ventura and newer versions, you're going to get a notification banner in the upper right, just like there is on your screen now, that alerts the user that the login item was added, which makes it even less stealthy. To be fair to Lamepire, in its time, that wasn't an issue, but it's making it even worse for it now. So we have no attempts at stealth and really half-assed persistence. What if we tried to make it better? What if we revived Lamepire into something more modern that'll run on modern versions of macOS and is just better? Let's make the Automator icon disappear and set it to the app we're trying to impersonate. Why don't we use Subterfuge so that it at least appears that they have the real Discord installed? Let's make it multi-stage. Now, there is benefits to making your persistent malware multi-stage. One, if you necessitate downloading components from a command and control server, it ensures that that device is able to access it. This way, if they have security controls in place that are already blocking you, execution won't continue any further, and you won't risk giving away all of your cards. We also want to resist removal better. Lamepire, you could literally just put it in the garbage and it would be gone. We also want to hide our ongoing presence as best that we can, namely not by dropping ourselves on the desktop. We want deeper persistence as well. And most importantly, we want staggered persistence so that we have multiple ways of maintaining ourselves. If they remove one of the components, that should trigger another component, even if they think they've removed it. So those were our goals, and this is what we came up with. Here's a video of the initial infection. It doesn't matter what you choose, it doesn't affect the functionality. And the purpose of this is to give the user dialogue fatigue so that they're thinking less about having to put in their password. There's that background items added banner notification. Let's assume they clicked on it and they started reading in here. Well, if we're fast enough, we can get the actual Discord to launch after we've established persistence, so that they'll think, oh, well, weird, but I guess that's just Discord. So overall, way better. But can you remediate it? So you can set up this lab for yourself using the source code. There's the GitLab repo to it, and you can also find it and all of our other tools on vandersecurity.com. The GitHub repo includes instructions on how it works. As for the C2 server, it's just an Apache file server, downloads via HTTP. If you take a look at the source code for Chicanepire, you see how it works and you can set it up yourself pretty easy. I hope that you try out the lab and that you're able to apply the techniques that you've learned here in order to improve the security in your own environment. All of our talks get posted up at vandersecurity.com in the research section, and hopefully I'll see you there. Bye-bye.